The clock on the courtroom wall didn't just tick. It felt like a heavy iron hammer striking an anvil in a silent canyon. Every mechanical click was a reminder that in this sanctuary, time does not belong to the powerful, the aggressive, or the loud. It belongs to the cold, hard scales of justice. That Wednesday morning, the air inside the chamber was unnervingly still. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that usually precedes a devastating storm. I have sat in this high-backed chair for more than 3 decades. I have watched the desperate, the broken, the delusional, and the bold pass through those double doors like a never-ending parade of human fallibility. But even after 30 years, there are moments that still manage to pierce through the calloused layers of experience. This was one of those mornings. Before me stood a 15-year-old girl, Michelle Flores. She was small, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible in a world that had suddenly turned violent. Opposite her were the Ramirez sisters, Ruby, a teenager who radiated a defiant, unearned confidence, and Bera, a 23-year-old woman who looked like she had spent her entire life convinced that the rules were things that only applied to other people. This wasn't just a simple disagreement over a teenage grudge. This was a case that exposed the raw, ugly underbelly of human nature, the pack mentality, the calculated cruelty of sisters, and the chilling silence of a mother who watched a child get brutalized and did nothing. The story didn't begin in this courtroom. It began in the mundane setting of a school bus, under the flickering lights of a neighborhood street, and in the toxic whispers of a high school hallway. It was a story about a missing phone, a simple piece of plastic and glass that became the catalyst for a systematic attempt to destroy a young girl's life. Ruby Ramirez had decided, without a shred of evidence, that Michelle was a thief. And once that narrative was set in motion, there was no stopping the momentum of the malice. The accusations were like a poison, spreading through the school, turning friends into strangers and strangers into enemies. Michelle had been called into the principal's office twice, forced to defend her integrity in a room where her voice felt too small to be heard. But the psychological warfare was just the prelude. The real horror was waiting for her on the pavement of her own neighborhood. As I looked at Bera, the older sister, I saw the face of someone who believed she could edit reality. She stood there with a practiced expression of boredom, claiming with a straight face that she wasn't even present at the scene of the crime. She thought that by simply denying her existence at that moment, the bruises on Michelle's face and the trauma in her eyes would somehow vanish. But in this courtroom, ghosts do not exist, and lies have no place to hide from the light. She walked out with her reputation restored and her head held high. She had stood up to her bullies in the most powerful way possible, by telling the truth in a room where the truth actually matters. The Ramirez sisters, meanwhile, faded into the shadows of their own shame. This case was a masterclass in accountability. It was a reminder that you can't hide behind a last name. You can't hide behind a stolen phone excuse. And you certainly can't hide from the consequences of your own cruelty. Justice wasn't just served that day. It was delivered with a force that made sure the entire city knew. In this courtroom, the weak are protected, the arrogant are humbled, and the bullies always, eventually, pay the price. I removed my glasses, the small clatter of the frames against the bench sounding like a gunshot. In the hushed room, I looked Bera in the eye, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that looked like fear. I don't have a crystal ball, I told her, my voice cutting through the air like a razor. But I have been watching people lie to me for 30 years. And you, Miss Ramirez, are not as good at it as you think you are. The tension in the gallery was suffocating. Every person in those benches knew that they were witnessing more than a legal dispute. They were witnessing a moral reckoning. The question wasn't just whether Ruby had struck Michelle, or whether Bera had stolen her phone while she was pinned to the ground. The question was how a family could become so disconnected from basic human decency that they would hunt a child in the streets like predators. As the first piece of evidence was placed on the bench, the reality of that Tuesday afternoon began to unfold in excruciating detail. Michelle had stepped off the bus, expecting the safety of her home, only to find herself surrounded. The sisters didn't want an apology. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted to exert a level of power that they lacked in their own lives. And as the first blow landed, knocking Michelle's glasses to the concrete and shattering her world into a blur of pain and confusion. The Ramirez family believed they had won. They didn't realize that their victory was temporary, and that the echoes of that violence would eventually lead them here, to a room where their titles, their excuses, and their lies would finally be dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. Every disaster has a quiet beginning, a small spark that eventually consumes everything in its path. For Michelle Flores, that spark was a missing phone. But in the ecosystem of a high school, a missing phone isn't just a lost item. It's a social death warrant. Ruby Ramirez didn't just lose her property. She lost her pride. And she decided that Michelle was going to pay for it in interest. The rumors didn't start with a shout. They started with whispers in the back of the bus, eyes following Michelle down the hallway, and the slow, deliberate isolation that only teenagers can master. Ruby began telling anyone who would listen that Michelle was a thief. She didn't need proof. In the court of teenage opinion, an accusation is as good as a conviction. Michelle started noticing the change almost immediately. Friends who used to sit with her at lunch suddenly had other places to be. Conversations died the moment she walked into a room. It was a psychological suffocating. Then came the official pressure. Ruby didn't just keep the gossip in the halls. She took it to the administration. Michelle was summoned to the principal's office. Imagine a 15-year-old girl who has never been in trouble, sitting in a room where the air smells like floor wax and old paper, being asked where she hid a phone she had never even touched. She sat in those hard plastic chairs twice, her heart racing, her voice trembling as she repeated the same truth over and over again. I didn't do it. I don't have it. But the suspicion had already taken root. Ruby was relentless. She didn't just want the phone back. She wanted to see Michelle break. She approached her on the school bus, leaning into her personal space. The metallic scent of the bus seats mixing with the sharp, aggressive tone of Ruby's voice. She told Michelle that the talk was over and that things were going to get real. Michelle tried to maintain her dignity. She looked out the window, watching the trees pass by, praying for the bus to reach her stop so she could escape the cage. She didn't realize that the bus ride was actually the safest part of her day. Outside those doors, a 23-year-old woman, an adult with the mind of a bully, was waiting to turn a schoolyard rumor into a criminal assault. The conspiracy was no longer just about a phone. It was about a family that had decided to take the law into their own hands. And the law they chose was brutal. The doors of the school bus hissed open on 42nd Street, and as Michelle stepped onto the pavement, the world felt eerily still. She began her walk home, her backpack heavy with books, her mind heavy with the stress of the accusations. But the path was blocked. This wasn't just Ruby anymore. Standing there was Bera, the 23-year-old sister who should have been at work, or at home, or anywhere else, but waiting to jump a child. This was a coordinated ambush. The sisters didn't say a word at first. They just moved in, closing the distance like predators who had been practicing this dance. Ruby struck first, a hard, closed-fist punch. That caught Michelle directly in the face. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull thud, followed by the clatter of Michelle's glasses hitting the concrete. In an instant, Michelle's world went from high definition to a terrifying blur. She felt her knees hit the ground. The grit of the sidewalk pressed into her skin. And then, the weight. Ruby was on top of her, fueled by a rage that had nothing to do with a phone and everything to do with cruelty. Blow after blow landed on Michelle's head and shoulders. She curled into a ball, trying to protect her face, screaming for help that felt like it was never coming. But the most chilling part of the assault wasn't Ruby's fists, it was Bera's hands. While Michelle was pinned down, struggling to breathe, Bera didn't pull her sister away. She didn't try to stop the violence. Instead, witnesses say she reached in and snatched Michelle's own phone right out of her pocket. It was a scene of absolute depravity. An adult woman assisting in the brutalization of a teenager. And a few feet away, the Ramirez mother stood like a statue. She didn't call the police. She didn't scream for them to stop. She watched her daughters act like animals, and she remained silent. That silence was a confession of its own, a confession that in the Ramirez household, violence was a family value. Michelle lay on the ground, her face bruised, her glasses broken, and her property stolen, watching the sisters walk away, as if they had just finished a routine. Sure, when the case finally reached Judge Judy's courtroom, The Ramirez sisters didn't come with an apology. They came with a script. Bera stood at the podium with a look of practiced indifference. A look that said, she was far too important to be bothered by something as trivial as an assault charge. She looked me in the eye and uttered, the most transparent lie I have heard in 3 decades. I wasn't there. She claimed she was a ghost. She claimed that Michelle, in the middle of being beaten, had somehow hallucinated an entire 23-year-old woman and decided to name her as an accomplice. It was a strategy of pure desperation. Bera thought that because there was no high-definition video of the exact moment she grabbed the phone, she could simply delete herself from history. But the law doesn't just rely on cameras. It relies on logic. I looked at this young woman, who had her whole life ahead of her, and I saw someone who had completely lost her moral compass. I asked her why on earth a victim would lie about who attacked her. If I punched someone, they wouldn't say I had her whole life ahead of her, and I saw someone who had completely lost her moral compass. I asked her why on earth a victim would lie about who attacked her. If I punched someone, they wouldn't say my bailiff did it. They would want the person who actually hurt them to go to jail. Michelle Flores isn't crazy. She isn't a pathological liar. She is a girl who remembers exactly who was standing over her while she bled on the sidewalk. The defense started to fracture when Ruby began to speak. She couldn't keep the timeline straight. Was the phone stolen 2 weeks ago? Or was it a month? Was the fight planned? Or was it an accident? The more they spoke, the more this stolen phone motive looked like what it truly was, a hollow excuse to justify a crime of opportunity. They had bullied Michelle for weeks, and when that wasn't enough to satisfy them, they decided to take her property as a trophy. Watching Bera try to maintain her cool persona while her sister's testimony fell apart was a masterclass in the collapse of a lie. They thought they could walk into my courtroom and play the same games they played on the street. They forgot that on the street, might makes right, but in this room, the truth is the only currency that matters. And the Ramirez family was quickly realizing they were completely bankrupt. In every case of bullying, there is a question that haunts the victim more than the punches or the insults. Where were the adults? For Michelle Flores, the answer to that question was the most chilling part of the entire afternoon on 42nd Street, because the person standing just feet away, watching the life being choked out of a 15-year-old girl, wasn't a stranger. It was the Ramirez mother. Imagine the scene. One daughter, a teenager, is pinning a child to the concrete. Another daughter, a grown woman of 23, is looting the victim's pockets. And the woman who gave them life is standing there, arms folded, watching it like a Saturday afternoon movie. She didn't scream for them to stop. She didn't pull Ruby off Michelle. She didn't call 911. She simply existed in the space of the crime, providing a silent, toxic blessing to the brutality. In the courtroom, the air turned ice cold when I turned my attention to this mother. I have seen many things in 30 years, but a parent who validates the criminal behavior of their children is a special kind of tragedy. She tried to offer a weak, stuttering defense, claiming she was just there, or that she didn't see the full extent of the fight. But the truth was written in the eyes of Michelle Flores. Michelle remembered the silence. She remembered the feeling of being completely alone while a family unit, a mother and 2 sisters, worked in tandem to destroy her. I asked the mother a simple question. Where did you go wrong? I wanted her to look at the wreckage of her children's character. I wanted her to see that by staying silent on that sidewalk, she had effectively handed her daughters the weapons they used to assault a child. The Ramirez mother didn't have an answer. She looked down at her shoes, unable to meet the gaze of a judge who was peeling back the layers of her family's dysfunction. This wasn't just a failure of a single day. It was a failure of a lifetime of parenting. You don't get a 23-year-old woman who thinks it's acceptable to jump a teenager unless she has been raised in an environment where accountability is a foreign concept. The mother's presence at the scene was the final piece of the puzzle. It explained why Ruby felt so bold. It explained why Bera felt so invincible. They knew that no matter what they did, their mother would stand by and let it happen. But they forgot one thing. While their mother might stay silent, the law has a very loud voice, and it was about to scream. The final minutes of the trial felt like the closing of a trap. The Ramirez sisters had walked into the room thinking they were the hunters, but as the evidence piled up, they realized they were the ones being cornered. The stolen phone story, the very foundation of their violence, had completely evaporated. There was no proof, no witnesses, and no logic behind their accusations. There was only a 15-year-old victim with broken glasses and a shattered sense of security, and two sisters who had mistaken their pack mentality for power. I looked at Ruby and Bera one last time. I saw two young women who had traded their futures for a moment of street-level dominance. And I saw a mother who had let it all happen. The verdict was a thunderclap that echoed through the hallways of the courthouse. I didn't just rule on the medical bills. I didn't just rule on the broken glasses. I ruled on the moral bankruptcy of the entire Ramirez family. I ordered them to pay for every cent of damage they had caused. But the financial penalty was the least of their worries. I made it clear that their names would forever be associated with this act of cowardice. Bera, the adult who claimed to be a ghost, was finally made visible to the world as an accomplice to an assault. Ruby, the bully who thought she was the queen of the school bus, was revealed to be a common criminal, and the mother was forced to walk out of that room, knowing that her silence had cost her daughters their dignity. As the gavel hit the wood, the sound was like a final door closing on the Ramirez family's lies. Michelle Flores walked out of that courtroom with something more valuable than a check.